Done.
There we are. Is the lovely Jane coming to join us?
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Well done, Jane.
Oh, you're on mute, Jane.
Oh,
Jane,
wonderful, wonderful. Apologies, Jane, apologies.
No, I'm just so sorry. I've messed you around. I hope not.
No.
It wasn't you.
Well, I've been in many places in the last few minutes, but I'm with you now. That's great.
Wonderful. So
we can go.
We can go. So
super.
Hello, New York, and good evening from Wales. I'm Larry Evans, and I'm chair of Wales Assembly of Women, an independent campaigning NGO based in Wales, in the UK, and we've got special consultative status to the United Nations Economic and Social Council, which enables us to gather every year at the Commission on the Status of Women, together with representatives of member states, UN entities, and other NGOs. So I'm really pleased to welcome you tonight to our parallel panel, Women's Representation in Wales, How Gendered is My Valley? Our panel draws together robust data, analysis, and evidence from postgraduate research in Wales to bring fresh perspectives to women's representation and what success various sectors have had at introducing greater diversity into their decision-making, their senior decision-making. We'll hear about the experience of women, elected women in Welsh local government, women in Welsh sport leadership, and disabled women in public life. Our three panelists, Leah, Philippa, and Ruth, have all been awarded Audrey Jones Awards for research by women. Wales Assembly of Women established the Audrey Jones Awards for research by women in 2016 in memory of a founder member, Audrey Jones, a woman from Wales who campaigned for women's rights across the world by representing our organisation at numerous UN meetings. And back when my wonderful colleague, Dr. Jane Salisbury, had the idea of setting up the awards in Audrey's memory, I don't think any of us envisaged presenting them on such an international platform. So I'd like to welcome you to the first ever Audrey Jones Awards to be presented in New York, courtesy of our new virtual world. And in doing so, I would like to thank Dr. Jane Salisbury, who coordinates the awards, for all our hard work behind the scenes and in creating a platform for women researchers to share their work. Thank you, Jane. Another Jane I would also like to thank is Jane Hutt, a member of the Welsh Parliament, who is with us here today. Jane is Welsh Government Minister for Equalities and has done a huge amount of work in Wales, both within the Welsh Parliament and beyond, to put women's rights centre stage. And as a good friend to both Audrey and Wales Assembly of Women, Jane has managed to find time every year to join us, to hear our Audrey Jones awardees and to present them with their awards. Thank you, Jane. So our panel on women's representation in Wales is very much on topic of the CSW priority theme this year, focusing as it does on the need for women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life. Who represents women and how women are represented matters. If we are to push for change, real change, we need to ensure that women have a place at the table. When women are in the room, different issues are addressed, different ways of working are adopted, and having visible and diverse role models helps break down barriers to leadership and raise the aspirations of young women. I am delighted our panel can contribute so effectively to that issue from a Welsh perspective. In Wales, we have much to celebrate on our journey towards gender equality, including the waves we created in 2003 as the first legislature in the world to achieve 50-50 gender balance with equal members of men and women, and the pledge by Welsh Government in 2018 to make Wales the world leader in gender equality. But even though there is much to celebrate, too often, women in Wales are still underrepresented in public life and business, paid less than men, and more likely than men to be working below their qualifications level, and often in precarious, part-time, low-paid roles, often because of caring responsibilities. That is why it is so important we get behind the agreed conclusions document currently being negotiated at CSW. One of the key areas is a section on women's leadership and decision-making that recognises peaceful, inclusive and sustainable societies require the participation and representation of women at all levels of government and in the formulation and implementation of government policies and regulations so they can reflect the concerns of women and girls. I'm pleased too to see recommendations in the conclusions that are working towards ensuring the full and effective participation and leadership of women in all stages of COVID-19 recovery. We absolutely need gender-sensitive approaches to our recovery. In Wales and the UK, as in most of the world, the pandemic has shone a light on existing inequalities in our society. Women, Black and minority ethnic women, people, young people, disabled people, and those living on low incomes have all been disproportionately affected by both the health and economic impacts of the pandemic. This is not inevitable. This is the result of our public policies. There has been much talk this week, both at the formal CSW sessions and in the NGO virtual forum about gender-based violence. Rates of domestic violence and abuse have increased as a result of the pandemic, as women have been forced to lock down at home with their abusers. We may never know the full number of domestic abuse cases because many may go unreported because of the lockdown. There are growing concerns too about the volume and nature of abuse on social media directed at women in public life. On the economic front, women have borne the brunt of job losses, with more women having been made redundant than furloughed, which will inevitably have an impact on women's jobs progression, income, and future pensions. For those that attended the UK's all-party parliamentary group for UN Women side event yesterday, you will have heard about the recent report by the UK government's Women and Equalities Committee that found economic support packages offered by the UK government to help support people during the pandemic were repeatedly skewed towards men. The report has called for further analysis to assess the equality impact of every policy and for efforts to avoid the same thing happening in our post-COVID recovery plans. For me, that analysis cannot come soon enough. Hard data matters. Hard data that looks at the evidence through a gendered lens matters. In Wales, Welsh Government ran a consultation inviting individuals and organisations to contribute ideas on how they would like to see Wales re-emerge post-COVID. Wales Assembly of Women responded by suggesting 3 positive actions to help women across the generations to enter or return to the workplace. The first, an apprenticeship scheme specifically for young women. The other 2 actions were aimed at older women who had taken time out of the workplace, which, as many of us know, can lead to an accumulation of disadvantage with us having repeatedly to sort of work our way back into the labour market. Our first suggestion for this group was a wage subsidy scheme for employers to encourage them to employ women returners, and the second, a call for a series of short-paid returnships, like an internship but designed for an older woman returning to the workplace. We like to think the Audrey Jones Awards for Research by Women is a similar positive action for female researchers, creating, as it does, a platform and a bridge between research and public policy. Decision-making is always better when diverse experiences are at the table. Of course, this diversity does not stop at gender. Our representatives should reflect our society in all ways, whether that is based on race, sexuality, culture, religion, disability, or socio-economic position. That is why we always need to take an intersectional approach to equality. Last year marked the 25th anniversary of the United Nations Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, still seen as the most progressive blueprint for advancing women's rights, and yet it is still to be ratified by any member state of the UN. New platforms and opportunities for women are key in ensuring the clocks are not turned back on gender equality. That's why I'm thrilled that as a small organisation, we've been able to create a new platform for women in academia through the establishment of the Audrey Jones Awards. Audrey herself really valued the need for hard evidence to back up campaigns on women's issues. I hope you will enjoy the hard evidence we will hear tonight from our 3 awardees. But before that, I'm delighted to ask Welsh Government Minister Jane Hutt, the longest serving Labour government minister in history, to speak. Jane's ministerial roles have included health and social services, children, education and equalities. She was the first woman in the UK to be appointed Minister for Finance, a post she held between 2010 and 2016, during which time she was also named as one of the most influential people in public finance. Thank you, Jane, for all your hard work and for giving your time again to join us this evening. Over to you, Jane. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be here tonight. And I really want to thank the Wales Assembly of Women for inviting me to take part in this incredible event. Thank you to Dr. Hilary Evans, Dr. Jane Salisbury, and all of you who have made this happen. And just to say how proud I am that in Wales, we have the Wales Assembly of Women, tireless, independent campaigning NGO, and so proud that you're accredited to the UN Economic and Social Council, and that you attend every major UN World Conference and have been attending since 1985. And I'm sure I'm right, friends and sisters, that actually Audrey Jones was also one of the people, the women who has attended when she was with us. And the fact that we have now got these awards, and the awards are being tonight, that we're showcasing the award winners on these crucially important points about women's representation and leadership in Wales is a fantastic achievement. So thank you so much. And I will just want to say a few words from my perspective of being Minister for Equalities, coming back into that role after many years at a very important time, recognising how much more we have to do locally, nationally and globally. Yes, the World Economic Forum tells us that gender parity is still 200 years away. Women are still less likely to be in paid employment, and when they are, will earn less than their male counterparts. Globally, girls are less likely to be educated. Fewer women work in technology and government. And women and girls are still more likely to be the victims of domestic abuse and violence. And women still can't do the simple things like walking home at night without fear, without the threat and the reality of violence. And I'm sure that we have all, and you have all remembered during these days, Sarah Everard and the many others like her. And in that remembering, we must unite again to end violence against women, to end violence against women and girls. We must honour Sarah's life by making changes to society and culture so that all women and girls can live fear-free. That is my ambition, and it is the ambition of the Welsh Government. And I made that clear in our Welsh Parliament, in our Senate yesterday, and I make it clear again tonight that that is our commitment. And Wales was the first nation in the UK to introduce legislation in this area. The Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Wales Act, passed in 2015, was a major step towards building a society where everyone can live fear-free. Sadly, the pandemic has highlighted the abuses that some people are living with every day. Restrictions have meant that most of us are spending more time at home. However, we've had a campaign with a public message: not every home is a place of safety. And that's a campaign that all our public agencies have embraced, and specialist services are supporting this initiative. And I'm really proud that our Live Fear Free helpline has stayed open throughout the pandemic. It's been able to continue to offer a free 24/7 service for all victims and survivors of domestic abuse and sexual violence, and those close to them, including family, friends and colleagues. We want a society and a culture where people are supported and no one is a bystander to abuse. We have achieved a great deal, but so much more needs to be done. It's now 1 year since Wales and the rest of the UK first went into lockdown, a year in which we have faced some of the most difficult challenges any of us have had to deal with. And we've all been affected by the pandemic, but we know that the impact of COVID-19 has not fallen equally. As I've already illustrated, the greatest impact falling on those with the least power, and it's deepening the entrenched inequalities in our society. Groups particularly affected, including women, but young people, people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, older workers, disabled people, and those with health conditions, as well as those in low skill and low pay occupations. And in Welsh Government, equality and human rights, impacts and considerations are at the centre, at the heart of the response to the pandemic and recovery in Wales. And of course, our Wales Assembly of Women put in exactly the right kind of responses based on the lived evidence of women into our recovery plan. In all my time in government, there's never been a time when we've had to face such enormous challenges or make such incredibly difficult decisions. And we all wish that this global crisis had not happened, but we can use it as a lever for fundamental change so we can ensure our future is fairer, more inclusive and more sustainable than our past. And Wales is ahead of the curve. Equality, sustainability and fairness are built into what we do. The Government of Wales Act requires us to mainstream equality in everything we do. The UN Sustainable Development Goals set out an ambitious agenda for transforming the world for people, planet and prosperity. And we share this ambition in Wales. We're committed to making our contribution to the goals. We're the only nation in the world so far to have translated the UN Sustainability Goals into law through our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And the Act requires public bodies in Wales to act in such a manner which seeks to ensure that the needs of the present are met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And the socio-economic duty, part 1 of the Equality Act, is coming into force at the end of this month. I was so proud to take it through the Senedd last week. It means that some public bodies in Wales, most public bodies, will have to think about how to protect the most vulnerable people in our society when they're making decisions about their priorities and services they deliver. And this duty is a way to level the playing field for those who are suffering socio-economic inequalities. And it will be a really significant part of how we build back not just better, but fairer as we come out of the pandemic. It will help us build on the good work the public bodies, local authorities in particular, are already doing. It will help us build a more equal Wales, a more globally responsible Wales, and deliver for those people who need our help the most. But we're still working through the issues that the pandemic has caused. Evidence has shown the pandemic is exacerbating the gender gap in work and at home. Overall, women tend to be taking on more childcare responsibilities, but our childcare offer, which provides 30 hours of early education and childcare to 3 and 4-year-olds, is allowing women to have more flexibility in the jobs they can do and helping them work more hours. And last year, I was proud that during the lockdown, we gave free childcare to our key workers. But we know that the workplace is often a place of inequality, where women often occupy low-paid, part-time and insecure jobs. Our role in supporting women to enter, remain and return to work has never been more important. And of course, we support a range of programs which help women upskill, change or advance their careers. We also work with employers to improve their equality and diversity strategies, and they have to sign an economic contract in which equality is embedded, and supporting people through personal learning accounts, in which we are also undertaking a gender budgeting pilot, supporting employed people, furloughed workers, and individuals who have been negatively impacted by COVID-19, helping people gain higher level skills and qualifications in priority sectors, further opening up opportunities for people to switch careers or upskill, so important for women, and the flexibility of the accounts that appeal to a wider range of people, especially women, gaining skills and qualifications in non-traditional sectors such as engineering and constructions. And despite the difficulties caused by the pandemic, there is positive news. We have been able to support women, helping them to stay safe, provide childcare support, creating training opportunities, and most importantly, supporting women and girls into STEM. Our work to end period poverty and embed period dignity in schools, further education and communities is ongoing. We provided in excess of £3.3 million to local authorities and further education colleges to support this process. And in this way, we hope to ensure that no girl misses out because they can't afford or access period products. Of course, these are all long-term goals, but we're acting on them now as immediate arrangements and actions and policy priorities. It's not just temporary support during the current crisis. The plan to advance gender equality in Wales, which I published last year, sets out our ambition and practical steps to advance equality for women and girls. And the Gender Equality Review sets out that long-term plan for change. Significant piece of work which will span 20 years of sustained intervention to create the changes we want. But what's crucial as we work through the pandemic is to acknowledge the lived experience of people who we represent and who we need to serve in terms of policy and priority. And that comes through diversity of representation in leadership and decision-making roles. And it's never been more important in terms of the diversity of thought, lived experience, fresh ideas, new perspectives, and better understanding of our communities as we seek to address and respond to the pandemic. We support organisations running mentoring programmes, providing women and Black, Asian, minority ethnic people with the tools and confidence to put themselves forward to engage in decision-making roles. And last year, I launched a public appointment diversity inclusion strategy, which sets out a wide range of initiatives to increase diversity in public appointments. We called that diversity a strategy reflecting Wales in running Wales, and that's what we want to seek. But we also want to pursue broader societal changes and which will make a huge difference. And that will engage young people, not only women, but all of the other underrepresented groups, as well as the intersectional approach, so that we can assure that we remain engaged, getting involved in public and political life, and that we have the role models and decision makers of the future. So what is so important in terms of the way forward is that we now have opportunities for our young people. We're taking forward voting rights for 16 and 17-year-olds, and they'll be able to vote for the first time in May when the elections to the Senedd Cymru Parliament of Wales take place. But Wales is not simply just an inward-looking nation. We look to other nations to learn from each other, to work together to create opportunities for fairer lives. And back in 2006, Welsh Government launched the Wales for Africa programme as a Welsh contribution to what was then the Millennium Development Goals. We support Wales Africa Community Links, Size of Wales, Fair Trade Wales, and also Sub-Saharan Advisory Panel and more. And if you haven't tried Jennifer's Coffee yet, may I urge you to do so. This is a fantastic project launched last year despite a global pandemic and climate emergency. And that is a project where led by a woman in Uganda, a coffee grower, who in the Fair Trade Fortnight recently virtually came to Wales and told us what it's been like for her as a mother, a grandmother, and a coffee grower in Uganda. And we have now managed to support her, to import her coffee into Wales. So we're very proud that Wales did also become the first fair trade nation. And that's how Jennifer's Coffee is a great way we're helping those farmers, women farmers, working in harmony with nature. So we're not simply looking to eliminate one form of inequality or discrimination. We know that we need to create the conditions for economic, climate, educational, social and cultural equality. These are big ambitions and I won't apologise for that. Across Wales and in Welsh Government, there's a genuine appetite to do things differently. And that's reflected tonight with what's coming forward from our wonderful award winners and the Wales Assembly of Women. Across Wales, of course, and in Welsh Government, we want to consider what legacy that we lead, what legacy we leave for our children, grandchildren, the generations that follow them. And you'll shortly, of course, hear more about it from Leah, Philippa and Ruth. And I want to congratulate them on their excellent research, because it is by gathering evidence and data and learning, as I've said, about the lived experiences of women, we can identify and share good practice while shining a light on areas where inequality persists and needs to be challenged. And this is how research really can contribute and make a difference to the lives of women and girls in Wales and further afield. And for me, as someone who came into politics, into formal politics and becoming an elected representative, it was because of my commitment to equality, fair play, chwarae teg, social justice, and seeing that some of us have got to put ourselves forward to step into that bear pit, as it often is, of politics, and say, right, we have got to then move forward and make the change through legislation, through standing up for the priorities and the needs, through the evidence that we gain, to ensure that we then do extend the status of women and ensure that we have a socially just and fair society. And that's what we believe Wales can be. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. Congratulations on an inspiring opening to our evening as well. I always feel when I listen to the trajectory that you take us through in terms of the Senedd and Welsh Government, and then I think of your own trajectory. And I just wish that Audrey Jones was actually with us on the planet, because she was a huge champion of yours. You know, totally congruent in your missions together, and she would be absolutely thrilled to bits to know that you are with us all the way, and you've been with us since we first launched the Audrey Jones Awards. And we've done that with the generosity, of course, and kindness of Robert Jones, who was, you know, a pro-feminist. He lived in a household with his mum and dad, Hugh and Audrey, and absolutely believes in what we do as this non-governmental body, which keeps our eye on the horizon. So it's inspiring to hear what Wales is about, and clearly a massive agenda ahead. But you know, evidence-based policy, this is a direct line into the Senedd of things that we know we can showcase. And we circulate the Audrey Jones Awards, obviously, to all the universities. And it tends to be the research active universities that put their candidates forward. But we are shifting our trawl for twinkling candidates to the autumn this year because of COVID, and we hope to have a real live session, and we hope that you'll come once again to deliver those lovely certificates and those prizes. So I'd like to formally thank Jane as Minister for Equality's Chief Whip for her time this evening during a punishing schedule. We know that. And thank you for your patience in us getting you into the arena. Thank you, Jane, very much indeed. Okay, moving on then. I won't repeat too much about Audrey, other than to say that she worked tirelessly. Several of us used that adverbial clause. Audrey worked tirelessly campaigning for women and girls' rights, and she travelled across the world, Brussels, Beijing, New York. She was omnipresent where it mattered. In the development of the shadow reports for CEDAW, in pioneering at the Fawcett Society, women's labour groups. She was on it. She encouraged Dame Tanni Gray Thompson, who we hope to recruit next year to our conference. She's in touch with us. Encouraged her to go for it in terms of elite sport and so on, got girls into mining and technology. So Audrey was a significant other to many of us, and I encountered her as a young teacher in a Barry school, and she got together a fantastic women's training roadshow where previous chairs, Jennifer Cole, modelled what it's like to be an arbitrator and negotiator in banking and finance. There were astronauts, there were all sorts of non-traditional roles. Audrey was behind that huge project at Cardiff University. So thank you to Audrey, and we know she's with us. She's through us all the time when we do these wonderful events. I shall move on now to introduce Leah Hibbs, our first speaker this evening. Now, Leah is a final year doctoral student at Cardiff University School of Social Sciences. She is supervised by Dr. Dawn Manet and Professor Paul Cheney. She's in excellent hands, but she's equally their match. She's very concerned about women's political representation and the experience of local councillors in Welsh local government. Her previous all-twinkling research, always distinctions and first-class honours, her previous master's research, she looked at the role of women in non-governmental organisations, particularly in improving their psychological empowerment, and looked at it as a precursor for augmenting their sort of civil activism. So she was particularly interested in the role of NGOs like the Wales Assembly of Women. But now she's looking at political representation in councils. Now, she's a busy bee, and she is gold dust in the School of Social Sciences, where she teaches alongside her doctoral studies. She teaches undergraduate programs and also transition programs where access type courses lead into undergraduate routes for mature students. She's a social theoretician, she's a social policy analyst, and she's writing a very exciting module and delivering that on political systems in Wales. So I'm going to hand over to our first Audrey Jones awardee of 2020, Leah Hibbs. Over to you, Leah.
Thank you, Jane. I will just share my PowerPoint, which hopefully will work properly. Am I all good? Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that very kind welcome and introduction. And I would just like to start off by saying it is a complete honour and privilege to be here this evening as a recipient of the Audrey Jones Memorial Award to talk to you about my ongoing research and my thesis on women's political representation in Welsh local government. So this evening I'm hoping to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of my current research findings, as well as a bit of a background to my project. But I just thought I'd start off with this sort of standout quote on this slide from one of my participants, which goes to show that whilst we might think we have come some way in achieving gender equality in politics, we still have quite far to go. So a woman in my study was speaking to me about how a man turned around to her and said that she would be better off in the kitchen with a tea towel cooking than in the political arena. So in today's presentation, I'm going to shortly talk to you about why Wales is such an interesting case study for women's representation in local government. I'll explain my core research aims, as well as the kind of influential literature, before talking about how I did my study. So I'm currently in the kind of writing up stage of my thesis, so writing up my findings. And then I'll get on to talking about the interesting stuff and getting to some of the findings of my thesis, which I've divided into 5 kind of subsections. And we'll see how far we get, but I'm happy to go into more detail about any of these in the Q&A afterwards if I don't cover any of it. So in terms of why Welsh local government and why Wales, so one of the key issues in terms of Wales and political representation of women is that there is a significant difference and a distinction between the representation of women in the Senedd and in Welsh local government. Obviously, we all know that Wales was the first national legislature to reach 50-50 gender parity, but there has unfortunately been a lack of a cascading down effect to the local level. And in Wales, we see a much starker difference between the national and local levels of women's political representation. Wales is currently standing at 28% women in Welsh local government, which leaves it at 3rd out of the 4 constituent countries of the United Kingdom. But it's not just those stark numbers, but it's also a lack of progress. At current rate of progress, it will take us 85 years to reach gender parity in Wales, which takes us to the year 2106. And these figures also hide a large disparity and distinction between councils and between the seniority levels within councils. So it gets even worse when you look up the seniority ladder within local governments. So women in senior positions, by which I mean as cabinet members and as local council leaders, lies at an extremely low percentage. And only 5 of the 22 local council leaders in Wales are currently women. Additionally, only one in one council in Wales, we have only 1 woman in the cabinet. So clearly we can see that Welsh local government is a particularly appropriate case study for studying women's lack of political representation. And I'm very keen to talk to you here today about my research into why this might be, and the things that fetter or facilitate women's political participation and representation in Wales. In terms of my research aims and influential literature, I'm not going to spend too long boring you on political science theory, but I will just talk to you about how my thesis aims to understand the gendered experiences of female local councillors in Wales, and how their experiences and other factors such as institutional practices, norms, contexts and cultures of Welsh local councils facilitate or fetter the representation of women's interests, but also how they affect women's lived experiences as female councillors. I've also included a specific focus in my study on what I've termed the labyrinth to leadership for female councillors. So looking at the experiences, the trajectories and the journeys of those holding or seeking to hold senior positions. In terms of literature and influential theory, I'm clearly looking here at the shift from what we may term looking like or descriptive representation to whether women, when they are elected, also act for women. So are we in a situation where governments may appear more democratic, but there has not been a marked change in organisational structures or a politics of redistribution? Alongside this, I'm influenced by feminist institutionalist literature, which understands that there is an interplay between the formal and informal processes, practices, and norms and contexts of political institutions, all of which combine to prioritise and privilege male political entrenchment. And finally, looking at literature on whether women face different journeys to senior positions, I find that, as the literature suggests, that women's journeys to these positions are longer than men, and they face these very much traditional, stereotypical barriers, including being pigeonholed perhaps into what we might term pink portfolios. So how did I go about studying this? Well, in terms of my methodology, I'm very much an in-depth qualitative researcher. So I've taken a case study research design using 4 case study councils in Wales. And these were chosen for a variety of reasons. Each of my case study councils has a particular reason behind why I've picked it. And that might be something from the majority control of the council to the descriptive representation of women, but also to the nature of the council as either rural or a city council, and the representation of women in terms of senior positions. This left me with a pool of 70 possible female councillors to interview, and I've now finished data collection with 19 interviews, all of which are over an hour long. My research took place over the years 2019 to 2020, and COVID-19 hit directly in the middle of that. So I faced a shift online during COVID, which led to a few research delays, but also was very beneficial insofar as it led to different findings into the positives perhaps that we might take from the pandemic, things that we could implement that we have learned in the past year, which could benefit women's political participation. So into the interesting stuff. So in terms of my current findings, first of all, I'm looking at gendered motivations, selections, and initial expectations and experiences of women. So looking at them in the kind of run up to gaining their local council roles. And what I find is that women are very much coming to being local councillors on the back of what is very much strong community activism and not deep-seated political ideology. So my previous research, as Dr. Salisbury mentioned, was looking at women's NGOs and their role in implementing and augmenting women's participation in civic life. And we can see here that it is participation at the community level and the organisations in the community which women become involved with, which are then kind of precursors to their political participation in these formal spheres. Interestingly, unlike Jane Hutt, who explained just now that she was very much influenced by her personal gender equality values. This is not something which my participants have been saying to me in my interviews. And in fact, the only interviewee who did volunteer the fact that she was a feminist, and that was a big factor for me, was Teresa, who, as you can see on the slide, talks about how this isn't the overarching sentiment in the party. And she was a Conservative councillor. So this was a particularly surprising finding for me, that the only councillor to voluntarily announce their feminism and announce feminist values as their motivation was a Conservative. However, there are other sort of factors at play here, insofar as Teresa was the youngest participant in my study, and she certainly was one of the most progressive of the councillors that I interviewed. In terms of selections, so we know that political party processes are this very much secret garden and very hard to kind of engage with and to tell what they kind of mean. But for the women in this study, being asked to stand and being specifically encouraged and being told that you should do that, you are appropriate for that position, was particularly important. And all except 3 interviewees were asked to stand to be local councillors. In terms of selection processes in political parties, getting the opportunity to stand is usually more by chance than design, and often relies on decisions of incumbent male councillors to retire. We know that male councillors are likely to serve more terms, and it was the case for these women that they only became local councillors off the back of an incumbent man deciding to either step down or through their ill health. Probably the most surprising finding for me in this research has been the attitudes, particularly of left-wing Welsh Labour women towards positive action, and particularly all women shortlists. This hadn't been something I was expecting going into my study. We've seen all the research, particularly Sarah Child's work, and others looking at kind of in the Labour Party and their successes in increasing women's representation through these positive action techniques and measures. So it was quite a shock to hear Gwen and Marie here talk about how they disagreed with all women shortlists, and about how they wanted to be where they were based on work ethos, but also that the perception that all women shortlists lead to too many women standing who Marie here feels are incapable of a political position. So it's interesting here to see what could be done in terms of improving women's descriptive representation if we aren't seeing the popularity of all women shortlists at the local level. In terms of expectations, women were very clear that they had expected all the classics, the streetlights, potholes. One woman referred to it as dog poo politics in local government. And the bureaucracy that they encountered when they first went into local government was particularly daunting and particularly intimidating for women who hadn't had, as most of my interviewees, who hadn't had any formal political involvement beforehand. As we know, the women in councils where there was less representation of women were very much aware that it was a male-dominated space. And Teresa was clear that she knew that the council that she was entering as a more traditional male-dominated council was also going to be a council which was dominated by older trade union, TUC, veteran Labour men. So looking at the formal organisational side of gendered institutions, there are various issues with the setup of local councils, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I could speak all night about things that local councils need to do in terms of their organisational practices. But pulling out some key themes, remuneration was something which was mentioned by a lot of interviewees who were talking about the pay that local councils get, or their remuneration, is just frankly too little. And this comes along the side the fact that the time cost of being a local councillor is much higher than perhaps bodies which review councillor remunerations take into account, and often means that women are either forced to go back into kind of part-time work alongside and the fact that being a local councillor cannot be a full-time job unless you're in a senior position. Alongside this, there were issues with expenses regarding childcare. So over my 4 councils, over the course of the current electoral term, only £45 worth of childcare had been claimed for by any councillor in any of the 4 councils. And as Marie explains here, this was very much a political choice. Very few councillors, as she said, would choose to put in an expenses claim because it's used as political ammunition, even if it's for childcare. So clearly this leads to issues around what I'm calling balancing the 3 Ps. So the political, the professional and the personal. And in terms of the political and professional, being a local councillor depends very much on the openness of one's employer to grant time off for council duties, but also depends on women's likelihood and kind of propensity to have enough money to live on to kind of reduce working hours alongside being a local councillor. In balancing the political and personal life, a work-life balance was not something which many of my interviewees viewed as being achieved by them as a local councillor. And it was clear that there were not many councillors in their local councils who had young families. And indeed, my interviews were clear that having a young family and having personal issues and being able to also be a mother alongside was something which was curtailed by the organisational practices of institutions. And this was things like meeting times, which are very exclusionary for women in local councils. They are often at school pickup times, or they can be kind of mid-morning where women who have to work perhaps are not able to attend. In terms of informal cultures and contexts, there is unfortunately still a culture of sexism in local government. As you saw from the quote on the first slide from Kerry here, there are very still overt comments being directed at women, which are gender-based. And there's also very slight, more subtle approaches towards sexism. So one of the kind of standout comments to me was from Rose, who talked about how she'd been married, as she says, for 25 years and never worn her wedding ring. But when she became a councillor, she'd start to wear her wedding ring again, which, as she says here, she thought was a reflection of sometimes how she felt uncomfortable or was made to feel uncomfortable by some of the interactions. I did interview councillors who had been councillors since the late 90s and early 2000s. And there is a sense that there has been some, albeit small, longitudinal change. Some councillors were clear that it had changed dramatically, and that, you know, the cultures and contexts of local councils have changed. But that was also put down to the fact that women, and perhaps cultures around women, being able to speak out and being able to be represented and make their voices heard, has also changed in society. For many councillors, however, local government's context was still off-putting. Sinead described it as Westminster on a small scale, and other councillors also spoke about how there is still some elements of an old boys' club. In terms of gender representation, and I know I haven't got particularly long, so I'll leave the gendered leadership stuff to the Q&A if anyone would like to talk to me about that. But in terms of whether women councillors act for women, there were councillors who were very clear that they had championed targeted policies for women. These tended to be biologically centred. At the moment, there is a lot of emphasis put on, for example, periods in poverty, and also anti-FGM movements. However, more generally, there is a sense that women think about things differently and do bring these kind of situated knowledges and lived experiences to their participation as councillors. So Gwen spoke about here the difference between her walking into a house with damp and water running down the walls versus her male colleague. And she was very animated talking about this and how she said, you know, she would kick off like a lunatic until they sorted it out. And that was because she viewed housing as something that was a woman's priority and was something that she focused on more and prioritised more than her male counterparts. We know the context of austerity is going to limit the amount of effort and the amount of money that local councils can spend on women-targeted issues. And there were women here who expressed regret that they couldn't have done anything more to represent women's issues or to fund projects for women in their local government. We've also seen a shift away from these perhaps women-targeted policies towards gender mainstreaming, and this was particularly seen by women in leadership. So just to sum up very, very quickly, my research is, I'm still pulling out all these findings, and I've got a lot more that I could talk to you about in terms of women's participation in Wales, but I'll leave it up to the Q&A if anyone wants me to go over anything else.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. Ellery, are you going to look at the questions in the chat box, or are we going to be more organic?
Oh, you're on mute, Larry.
Gosh, I've had that phrase said to me now. The question, I don't know if you've seen the question, Jane. I have to distinguish between the two of you. To recognise the problems, do you recognise any of the problems identified in Leah's Hibbs research as she's been talking about? Do you think there's any progress? There's another question there. Does Wales's geography shape women's experience? I suppose the issues of travelling around.
Right. Shall I come in, Larry? I mean, it's very interesting, fantastic research, because I was a counsellor for 12 years, and I used to think there were so few women in, and this was a long time ago, but I do think it's really important that women consider going into local government, and that's the only way it'll change. But I think so much of what has come through from that research and talking to women in local government, sadly, it's still very true, because we focus very much on trying to promote equality in the Welsh Parliament and the Senedd, and now we need to spread that and share that in Welsh local government. But I'm very pleased that there are some very outstanding leaders now in Welsh local government, and in the pandemic they've played a really important role, because the leaders have been absolutely instrumental, and they've been meeting every week with our minister, who is a woman, Julie James, Minister for Housing and Local Government, and we have so many ministers in the Welsh government. I mean, we absolutely represent a very different kind of way of women's representation in government, let alone in the Senedd as a whole. So it's I think there is change, that there is hope, but we need to recognise that local democracy and getting women into those roles where actually you are delivering services on the ground and making change. But I've mentioned, I mean, all of the local authorities are subject to the public sector equality duty, to the socio-economic duty coming forward. So, they have got statutory responsibilities. They've had to do equality impact assessments in terms of the decisions that they have to make. So, equality has to be also mainstreamed into their thinking and their priorities. So I very much hope that we will see a change, but your research, Leah, is going to be crucially important. Ironically, the whole issue about geography has been changed in terms of access over the past year, because we can all meet each other virtually without having to get into a car. It's strange after a while, just looking at screens, but actually it means there are less barriers to participation in some ways from virtual working, and you can get everybody engaged in those kinds of in that sort of setting and arrangement. But really great research.
It is fascinating there. And just to ask you a quick question, I was just wondering what you thought was the sort of biggest surprise in your initial data collection. You commented on some women not being sort of feminist, and was that your biggest surprise or not? Or?
Yes, I think the very strong negative opinions of all women shortlists from Welsh Labour councillors was my particularly something that was very much of a shock to me. I've experienced, obviously looking at it from an academic point of view and reading all the literature on all the benefits of quotas and these positive action techniques in increasing women's representation, and seeing that from the kind of Labour Party and how that very much boosted their representation of women in national, in Westminster. I very perhaps, naively thought that would be something reflected in my interviewees, but yeah, for some of the comments coming through about women being elected who weren't, who shouldn't be there, who didn't have the ability to be there, I thought that was particularly shocking for me. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
But I did want to pick up, on what Jane Hutt was saying about the difficulties of geography. And that was something, one of my councils was a very rural council. And my interviewees spoke about how in normal times, it would take them 45 minutes each way to get to their council offices. And we spoke in depth about the benefits from the pandemic. And this was one of the kind of positives that they were seeing as coming out from COVID, as Jane explained. And something which needs to be, I think, employed going forward, as it does open a lot of doors to women who could, depend, irrespective of meeting times, log onto a laptop with the children around, and kind of Zoom or Skype into a council meeting. So I think that's an organisational change which has to happen. I think that has to stay after COVID. I don't think we need to go back to this kind of what we might call male presenteeism of local council meetings, and having the availability of hybrid approaches of women be able to Skype in, even if there is a kind of physical meeting, I think is particularly important.
I would agree with that. I'm just going to take my lead from Dr. Salisbury. Should we crack on now? I know.
Yes, yeah, I think we can do. We're a little bit 5 minutes shifted on, but I'm keeping time.
Yes, exactly.
Would you like to introduce Philippa?
Yeah. So I'm gonna. So that was wonderful there, and I think that's started us off fabulously for the evening, and I'm now going to hand over to Philippa, who again is sort of talking about women in leadership and the need to get women in leadership, and this is in Welsh sport, in areas of sport, and she's going to talk about the equality, gender equality and gender inequality that women leaders in sport have faced. And again, maybe as a result of COVID, we're so much more aware now of the value of exercise, even from getting out to a walk, so we know it matters to us all as individuals and as a society. We've missed going to watch it. We've missed, in my case, going for a walk. And then there are people that have missed playing football and stuff like that. But I understand that women in Wales now account for 30% of sports leaders. So for the first time, it's possible to do some analysis around their experiences and to see what barriers they've faced and how they've overcome them, and whether I think sort of in reading about Philippa's research, some of those sort of informal rules and the ways of working are still sort of barriers there, even though maybe we've got the gender equality policies to encourage women in. Maybe a bit like Leah was talking again, there's those informal, the norms, the practices, the way of people going, those barriers are still there. So over to you, Philippa. Thank you.
You're on mute, Pip.
Classic. Hello, thank you. I did say thank you to Larry for that introduction. And yes, I'm going to be talking about my research, which looked at women's leaders' experience in their Welsh sport leadership roles. So today's presentation, I'm going to start very briefly with the aims of my research overall, and explain what the methods were that I used, and then hopefully spend most of the time talking about the results of my study. And today I was going to focus, although the study looked at both sort of the more formal, so the rules, the official rules of organisations, I'm going to spend most of today talking about the more informal, as Audrey said, the informal practices and norms that people act and experience in sports organisations, and then finish up by having a look at the impact of the results and perhaps the future as well. So to start with, why is sports policy important? Well, it's not one of those key areas that you traditionally associate with being important to women's movement and women's rights, but it does have, sport has incredible impacts and this well-documented established benefits for all people in terms of health, health and well-being, and also for nations and communities in terms of economic benefits, and for countries in terms of that sort of building a nation. Often a lot of pride and national unity is built through sport. Despite all these benefits for both the individual and the community, there's still a participation gap, and that is repeated across the world internationally in every country, and in Wales as well. As you can see the data there on the screen, the differences between men and women and girls and boys in their participation rates in sport still persist. Although in Wales it has closed over recent years, it's still there. Sport's also important in terms of the third sector and NGOs, and in Wales it counts for 22% of all third sector organisations are sports organisations. And it's also a key area for Welsh Government, and with an annual spend of £22 million. And a key area within that has been the promotion of gender equality in sport. As I mentioned, it's traditionally in the academic research, it's less focused on than other key areas that are associated with women, like violence against women and girls, housing, social welfare. So it's an interesting area to perhaps have a look at. And like Hilary said, for Wales, it's a perfect time to have studied it, because it's for the first time in history that where women now account for 30% of sports leaders. So my study aims were to look at the promotion of gender equality in sporting organisations, and to do that by having a look at women leaders' experience in their roles. And the aim was then to have a look at the factors which advantage women and disadvantage women. So my method was to interview 30 women leaders. So by leaders, I mean women of CEOs, chairs and board members of national governing bodies, which are the individual sports organisations which govern each individual sport in Wales. Sport Wales, which is the public body within Wales that organises and delivers sport on behalf of Welsh Government, and Welsh Government and National Assembly, Welsh Parliament members as well. You can see on that bottom group that tier 3 is subdivided into 3 further groups, and that was because I wanted to compare women sports leaders in very women-dominated sports against those in perhaps neutral sports where there were both a general balance of men and women, girls and boys in those sports, and very male-dominated sports. Now, obviously, there's a larger pool of male-dominated sports in Wales, although again, that has gradually changed over the years. And just very briefly, I'll touch on this. The way that I interpreted the results was using this institutionalist approach, where you're examining both the informal ways of things that work in organisations against the ways that the rule said it should work. And today I'm going to be looking at the informal, so the way it really works, even if the rules are saying it should be working slightly differently. And I applied a gendered lens to that analysis to make sure that the gendered culture was really at the centre of the results. So the results. Now, it's worth saying before I dive into these that most of the barriers that I'm going to talk about today, so the negative results, were more predominantly found in the male-dominated sporting organisations. So, and that was either when participants from other organisations dealt with those organisations or the women leaders who were within them. So to begin with, I had a look at informal narratives, so the stories that are told within those organisations and the impact on women. So the first negative narrative, which acted as a barrier to women leaders, was a story, a narrative that was common within the sector, the sporting sector, that there were a group of female women leaders within sport who were perceived to be lesbian, and that perception was used as a tool by some very senior male sports leaders as a way to undermine those women, and by association then all women. So this narrative was perpetuated behind, so not behind those women's backs, so they didn't know that that was occurring. The second negative narrative that was used as a barrier was a false perception of tokenism. So within sports policy, slightly differently to Leah's, there is no quota of women, no official quota of women leaders required. So Sport Wales does have a target that they would prefer organisations to hit. So at the time when I did my results, a target was brought in halfway through my data collection of 35%. It's now increased to 40% of either gender. But it's not mandatory, and organisations aren't penalised for not meeting that target. And despite that, though, that had still created the same sort of narrative that Leah experienced within sport, where women were labelled as perhaps only being there because of that target rather than their merit. The third negative narrative was about, which was spoken about by some men and actually some women, that quality has been achieved. So we don't need to try anymore. We've got women on some boards. Why do we need any more? And there was a really interesting example of that, where a woman who was one of very few women on her board said that perhaps her male colleagues' perceptions of women had changed because she was on the board. But if you'd asked them, okay, so should we have 50% women? It would have been an expletive no, that was not a good idea. In terms of the more positive side of things, there were some positive narratives that were very new within the sector. And the main one was, in the last 5 years in particular, that women's sport had really gained a credibility, and thereby association, women leaders in sport had also gained more credibility. So, and this further broke down into women leaders who were ex-athletes in particular. That was really useful to them because of the boost in women's sports credibility. And also in terms of women's sports having that boost, then more applicants wanting to be on the women-dominated sports boards, which the prestige of that has increased. Moving on, in terms of looking at the more practices, I've looked at sort of the narratives, the stories within these organisations and effects of those. There were also practices, so actions that people were taking within organisations, or actions they were doing. So again, I looked at ones that were barriers and then ones that were positives to women. So in terms of the negative ones, one of the main ones was the use of sport talk. So in particular in Wales, very specifically, it was many women women leaders said it was incredibly important for them to be really competent and knowledgeable in being able to talk about men's rugby. So in Wales, rugby is the national sport. It's really important. And within the sports sector in Wales, that's even more true. So if one leader said, I feel like my success in my role and my credibility is not based on my ability as a leader, it's based on how knowledgeably I can speak about men's rugby. And her sport had nothing to do with men's rugby.
Gosh.
Other practices included things like banter in the boardrooms. Again, you find that in other sectors, the use of banter in leadership positions. The women leaders felt that perhaps it was more negative in sport, because sport is such a banter is part of sport. It tends to be. So you've got ex-athletes then moving into leadership positions who are very familiar with that banter culture through their training. And then also things like gendered language. Many of the formal documents, a couple of those still had things like chairman, and one of them actually still had he all the way through their formal articles of association. And that obviously feeds through into reports of some male colleagues in particular, male leaders, still using he as instead of he and she, and things like that. And using gendered insults as well. So this links to the third practice there of unprofessional behaviours. So that's a range of actions that women were reporting, ranging from more abusive, physical, sexual abusive situations, ranging up to things like being ignored in meetings, spoken over, women in board meetings having questions directed at them, and then a male colleague answering it for them before they've had a chance to speak. And gendered language, so being called bimbos and other more expletive terms on occasion. And then finally, that the third negative practice there was about that informal gendering of roles. And I think Leah touched on this as well, that roles with equality were either informally directed at women or assumed to be women. So in terms of that, and also this is a mix between unprofessional and gendering of roles, that women were still being asked or assumed to in some organisations deal with tea and coffee in the board meetings. There were positives though as well in terms of new practices that women were engaging in, and the most important, strongest one was the creation of these informal networks. And these were really important, whether some women spoke about them very directly and some spoke about them indirectly. But there were the common things were like passing on opportunities and job opportunities to other women, mentoring informally other women, meeting together and building those informal networks where they can sponsor each other and help each other. And that's been really, really important. So altogether, you can see from the results I've shared with you that there are, unfortunately, in this set of results, the informal side of things, still many more negative factors than positive ones. And that's really important in understanding why perhaps things are still not 50-50 and are still not gender balanced, and why there's still those barriers to change there. And I like to use that, you can see the cogs there, as understanding how those narratives and practices sort of link together and underpin each other. So for instance, the narrative that I spoke about of the lesbian mafia, well, if you believe that narrative, that makes sense that perhaps lesbian mafia, that women would only pick other women leaders to be leaders, and therefore those women leaders are token women, And if you then believe that those women are only there based on the fact they are women and not for their other professional characteristics, then perhaps you would engage in unprofessional behaviour to undermine or be rude or dismiss them. And to link it back to some academic theory, very perhaps boring, but that theory, that's called the logic of appropriateness. And it may explain why some men and even some women may engage in those sorts of attitudes and behaviour and why it persists. So although that's sort of the more negative side of things, of why things are not changing in some areas, there was actually, in every single woman I interviewed, a real hope for the future in sport. There has been tremendous change. It wasn't that long ago that there were no women in sport in leadership positions, or very few. And so that change is a source of excitement for the future and expectation that it will continue. A key area that all the women were very keen to move on to was much better representation for women from particularly BAME backgrounds, and the difficulties or the perceived difficulties around that, whether that is correct or not, and an excitement about the changing of portrayal of women's sport in the media, which in Britain and Wales has changed considerably in the last 5 to 10 years. And also an excitement about the impact on lower down at grassroots level and for participants in sport. Again, things are changing very quickly in sport. So I think that's everything. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Philippa. That was very, very interesting in all sorts of ways, and resonating with many of Leah's findings about vocabularies and so on. I've typed in the question box, in the chat box, it seems that there's a hidden curriculum for women in sports leadership. And I'm wondering, you know, to be able to discourse in a bantery way about rugby, should Women's Assembly be writing a vocabulary handbook, a guidance book to help our women in Wales enter the arena? You know, I mean, clearly there's been good movement, but there does seem that measure of somebody's ability to talk loquaciously about the match and about, you know, and so on. I find that really, really interesting. Yeah. So I have put something in the chat, but Audrey, would you like to scan your eyes over the chat and the questions that are there? Oh yeah, well, there is a question. I found it. It's mine. How easy was it, Philippa, to recruit women to your study? Because Wales is small, you know, and we know that people are, obviously you give anonymity through pseudonyms, but were they keen to participate?
They were really keen. So many women were really eager to be involved because they wanted to share what their experiences were. They had great concerns over being identifiable and that then impacting their careers.
Yeah.
So I followed a method whereby if I directly quote any women in written form, I need and attribute that to a group. So them being in a female or a male dominated sport, I need to go back to them and say, look, this is what I've quoted and this is the context I'm using it in. Are you happy? And at that stage they can say no, or I'd like it changed. Or so participant validation at every stage of the research. So that's made it more time consuming on my part.
Of course.
But it meant that women who otherwise wouldn't have been comfortable being interviewed and going into the depth that they did were then felt comfortable to be included.
So it's a very ethical position. You know, your research will have gone through the ethics committee in School of Social Sciences, and yeah, that's a very nuanced and sensitive approach, because gatekeepers are interested in what will help or harm them. So I'm really heartened to hear that you did that. Thank you. Audrey.
I was just going to say there is another question in there saying, with the hopeful prospect of Wales winning a Grand Slam this Saturday. Is that likely to sort of increase sort of inequality? You know, is that sort of maybe, does it go up and down with the success or not of the Welsh rugby team? You know, do highlights in male sport increase inequality? You know, with the exclusion of women leaders. Maybe it's a bit of a tough one. Or would you expect it to maybe?
In terms, there is still, like, Wales rugby is like the perfect example. It's still, when we talk about Grand Slam, all of us Welsh people know that we're talking about the male side, the game. So that's an interesting first point. Men's success in sport, part of the funding is released, both Welsh government funding and other sources of funding is based on, in part, and success of that sport on the elite side of things. So there is that tie-in as well to money, which over the years, obviously, most money has gone into male sport. And there's, as in all areas of life, there's only a certain amount of money. So in order to balance that up, obviously, in some cases, the male side of sport is losing money. And it is a loss to be then put into the female side. But it, in my opinion, and the opinion of most of the leaders, that needs to happen.
I've got a time for another one, Dr. Salisbury?
Yes.
It's been asked here, any input from men in your data? And I think the answer is...
So no, I took a decision, because it was the first study of these this group of women, to just focus on women, because I wanted to understand women's experience before looking at the male's experience of gender equality. It would be really interesting, though, to do that. And many of the women spoke really passionately about male allies. And some of the organisations that have achieved the most change in the last 10 years have been where you've got either a female chair and a male CEO, or vice versa, working together, and having a male and a female that are both really committed to gender equality and want to push that forward, was really powerful. So yeah, it would be an interesting further stage to interview those men as well.
Yeah. That's your postdoctoral study. I'm sure you know that Wizard, which is located at Cardiff University, the Welsh Institute for Research, I'm sure they'd be interested, and Professor Paul Cheney, who's involved in your academic journey, I'm sure they'd be interested in a follow-up study, actually. But at the minute, women are in our analytic gaze. So thank you very much, Philippa. That was super. And I'm sure we might get a chance to chat further at the end. Thank you. So I shall introduce now our third awardee, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ruth Naughty. Now, Ruth won an Audrey Jones Award in 2019, and it was based on an absolutely outstanding MSc dissertation. And Ruth, on the basis of that, has put in an application to the Economic and Social Science Research Council, and Disability Cymru are also co-funding, and she now has a doctoral candidature in the Cardiff University Business School, but she's on maternity leave, having given birth to a beautiful little boy just in December. So Ruth has been brilliant to come and join us tonight in her cocoon of maternity leave, but she's still being a scholar, and she's basically interested in, for her doctoral work, it will be on disability employment gaps, and she's keen to apply a sort of intersectional lens, and it will look at the effects of living with multiple protected characteristics on people's lived experience, and in particular, the experience of Black disabled women, because Ruth identifies as a disabled individual, having acquired a visual impairment back in 2006, but it hasn't stopped her at all. She's flying, and she's going to talk to us tonight about the representation of disabled women in public life. So I'm going to hand over to Ruth. Over you go, Ruth.
I'd just like to say thank you very much to Wales Assembly of Women for giving me this opportunity to present my research. As Jane said, my research is focused on representation of disabled women in public life in Wales. So I'm just going to talk through my dissertation, which I completed in 2018, and I'll start by an introduction, really, just an overview. So currently in the UK, there's approximately 14.1 million people who are classed as being disabled. Wales actually has a higher proportion of disabled people, which is approximately 25% of the Welsh population. However, despite the large number of disabled people living in Wales, they still remain unrepresented in elected office, so and in public life generally. Currently, there are 3.7% of 3.7% of public appointments are being held by disabled people. The number for councillors is actually slightly higher at 36%, but the number of the age range of councillors is generally quite higher. And as we know, with disability, that's something that we see with a higher age group as well. So that explains that. However, disabled women still remain quite very marginalised within public life and within elected office. And being a disabled woman myself, this is something that I was interested in looking at. So that's why I conducted my research on this topic. Just to look at the research context and the background, as many of you know, the right to equal participation in public life is included in many of the United Nations treaties, including the treaties on human rights for women and for disabled people. However, currently across the UK, so that's within central government and within the devolved nations, these rights aren't enshrined into domestic law. So it's up to individual nations themselves and to what sort of stance or what support they give to actually guaranteeing equal participation. So bear me a second. So across the, so globally, the actual representation of women within the so upper or lower houses of parliament is 24.5%, and the UK is ranked 39th in the world, so out of 190 countries, for the representation of women within parliament. So that figure has actually remained stable for the last few years. However, there's a lack of data on the representation of disabled people within Parliament globally, but also within central UK Parliament and within the devolved nations as well. So this is an area that does need working on in terms of data collection. There have been a number of positive action measures used within the UK. So these are initiatives such as the Access to Elected Office Fund, which at the time of writing my dissertation has actually closed. But this was a fund that supported disabled people with the extra costs that they might incur for running for elected office or running for an appointment within public life, such as for people that are British Sign Language users having an interpreter available, or people that aren't able to use public transport or don't have their own transport, maybe having support from a support worker who'll be able to drive them or assist them in any extra activities that they needed doing. Our previous research has found that women, so disabled women that are involved in public life, have experienced, so 55% of women actually experience discrimination other than that of gender discrimination. So many disabled women, which I'll talk about in my findings later, have discussed experiencing discrimination on account of their gender, so because they're women, but then also on account of being disabled as well. Now, just to look at the role of diversity, so public life in Wales. So as has been mentioned before, Wales was the first legislature in the world to achieve gender parity in 2003. However, since that was achieved in 2003, the actual number of female members of the Senate has decreased and has remained the same for many years now, for the last few elections. So that is something that I kind of looked at and we're looking at how we can actually increase the number of women, but also the number of disabled people as well. So although the data around women has been collected, there isn't any official data at the moment that actually calculates or that collects the number of disabled people or disabled members of the Senate at the moment. However, a representative figure would be around 15 members of the Senate, and that would be representative of the Welsh population. Now, there have been a number of positive action measures that have been launched by the Welsh Government to actually increase the number and increase diversity within public life in Wales. So these included a scheme called Step Up Cymru, which was a mentoring scheme that supported people from marginalised groups and gave them access to mentors and access to sort of initiatives and support that would help them to gain confidence and understanding as well about the political situation in Wales and within public life as well. Now, in terms of disability policy in Wales, the first sort of disability policy was called the Framework for Action on Independent Living. And this looked at a number of different areas of disabled people's lives and the way that they could be supported to develop and empower disabled people in different areas. It did include an area of looking at disabled people's representation in public life. However, the initial framework for Action on Independent Living was actually criticised for not failing to really increase the number of disabled people that were involved in public life in Wales. I'm just looking at sort of the first lot of findings. So my first research aim was to look at how disabled people were represented in policy discourse. So these were documents that were published by Central UK Parliament, then also by the devolved nations as well. And looking at this policy discourse, I noticed that there was a greater awareness of UN obligations by documents published from UK government, so UK Parliament, then from the devolved nations. And there was also greater discussion on gender, so gender equality rather than looking at disabled people and disabled people's representation. And that was something that was throughout the whole policy discourse on the diversity within public life. I also noticed as well that there were sort of inconsistencies within the language used within the policy discourse. So for example, there was the UK Parliament would discuss how they had adopted the social model of disability, which looks at removing the barriers that disabled people face within society. So these might be environmental barriers, physical barriers, such as getting into a building, or it could be barriers, so attitudinal barriers, so changing negative attitudes towards disability as well. And there was sort of inconsistencies with the language used around the social model of disability. And there was also a lack of discussion, particularly I noticed from the documents published in Wales, a lack of discussion on CEDAW and the rights of sort of gender equality, and also ensuring that disabled people have rights within public life as well. What I did notice though is I analysed the political parties' manifestos from the 2017 elections that were held, general elections that were held here across the UK. And from that analysis, I noticed that there was actually a lack of discussion across all political parties on how on increasing particularly gender equality, but then also the political parties' obligations under the United Nations conventions. Looking at the manifestos, the greatest support for gender equality came from the Women's Equality Network, who specifically said that they wanted to increase the women's representation within public life, and also specifically disabled women's representation as well within public life, which was great to see. However, it's a shame that that wasn't sort of looked at across whole political parties. Now moving on to then looking at the findings of my research. So I conducted 7 interviews with disabled women who are involved in public life, and they're involved in different areas of public life. So some women were had run for elected office within the Welsh Senedd Cymru. Some other women were councillors and held a councillor position. Some women held public appointments as well. So there's a variety of different experiences. Now, the first slide that we'll look at was the findings was attitudes towards disability. And sort of unsurprisingly for myself, as I worked in the disability sector, there still remained negative attitudes towards disability. So the women found themselves that once they had declared that they were disabled, that they were living with health condition or impairment, people's attitudes towards them changed. They felt that people became less positive about their abilities and what they could do and what they could bring to the role. And this really affected the opportunities that were given to them within public life. However, on the other side, so on the flip side, I did notice that some of the women that I spoke to, one woman in particular, said that her constituents actually thought that by her having a living with an impairment, which is a visual impairment, was actually a benefit, as they saw that this particular councillor said the constituents had gone to many different councillors in many different areas for support, but they didn't, they couldn't find the support. But then by coming to that particular councillor, she was able to support them, and even though she was finding it difficult herself to access materials and information in accessible formats for herself, she went that extra mile. And so her constituents actually said that by her having an impairment and living with impairment and facing those barriers, she was more empathetic to their cause. So in that case, it was actually a positive. They saw that as a positive for them having being disabled. And moving on to the next findings, which, sorry, spare me a second. The next findings, which looked at sort of the psychological effects of living or running in public office with as being disabled. Now, many of the women have felt that due to the negative attitudes that they experienced and that came across within public life, they actually internalize these emotions and these attitudes, which actually then put a limit on their aspirations and what they thought that they could achieve and they could bring to their role in public life. So it took one particular woman, took her a long time to actually overcome those barriers that she had internalized, overcome those attitudes she's internalized, to actually stand for elected office and then progress and succeed within her role, within a public appointment as well. And then there's also disabled women felt that I spoke to, they felt that because they had to, they came across different barriers and which they had to overcome and they had to find their own solutions, actually made them more resilient and made them stronger. So in terms of having come across barriers, so one lady that I interviewed, she discussed that she was a British Sign Language user and she needed an interpreter. And initially when she joined the political party, there was apparently no funds at a grassroots level. There weren't the funds to actually support her and to get the interpreter in. So she campaigned and she campaigned and she kept asking and asking. And in the end, she managed to get that. And although she said that it was really hard and really tough on her to have those battles, to have to overcome those barriers again and again, it actually made her stronger and made her more determined to actually get that, gain that position within elected office, and also fight and campaign for other people, so that other people coming up behind her didn't have to overcome those barriers as well. That's positive. And as we just discussed, there were many women discussed many barriers that they faced within participation. One barrier that springs to mind was that of attitudinal, so to talk about the negative attitudes that people faced. Then also within political parties, a lot of the way that people say, for example, gain their stripes and gain their merits is done with it at the grassroots level. So that might be campaigning, so going around door knocking, or bringing people campaigning over the telephone. And for some disabled people, particularly disabled women, this may be quite difficult. For example, if you do have a hearing impairment, speaking to somebody over the telephone or even door knocking can be quite an anxious experience and something that you're not able to do. So some women found that the way that the political parties are set up at the moment and the way that people recognise your strengths does not actually work in favour for disabled people. And that attitudes in that way needed to really change so that disabled people could be included. And at the moment, at the time of writing my dissertation, there was no formal support for disabled people. So as I mentioned, the Access to Elected Office Fund was not in place at the time of me writing my dissertation. So disabled people weren't able to actually access any formal support, and any support they did have was done on an informal level. So it was somebody within the party, either supporting them to, by going around with them to do the campaigning, so having that physical support of someone coming around, or even people putting information into a larger font. And like I said, at the time of writing my dissertation, there wasn't any support for sort of travel. So it might have been somebody within the party themselves actually picking the candidate up, taking them to a meeting or to go and do their campaigning, their door knocking, their canvassing. So that was something that put them off in actually initially running for elected office as well. And then also, just like another finding was participants' reflections then on their impact within their roles within public life. And the participants that I talked to, the disabled women I talked to, had a variety of different impacts that they found. So they found that being disabled themselves and having to overcome different barriers made them actually more willing and more impassioned to take up the roles in public life, but also to make public life more accessible and inclusive to other people. So not just other disabled people, but a wide range of people. So people, making it more inclusive to people from different ethnicities, from people different ages as well. They found that they were able to fight causes for other people, which maybe others, the non-disabled people, weren't able to recognise or weren't able to really understand. So that's a really good positive. Also found that, as I mentioned before, disabled women found that they were a lot more resilient, and their roles within public life were actually stronger, and made them stronger. Another example as well was that disabled women were actually able to change the structures, so the actual institutions. For example, one individual who had a vision impairment, she found the actual recruitment process for applying for a public appointment really excluded her and was very difficult for her. So once she actually gained her role as in that public appointment, she worked really hard to then change the structure, so to change the recruitment process to make it more accessible. Another lady who defined herself as having autism, she described how the practices that she had to go through to become an elected office, to run for a position within the Welsh Senedd, she found that it was really exclusionary to her. So once she had run for that place in office, she made it her work to actually make the practice open and make it more inclusive to people with a range of different impairments as well. So there was a positive, and the women felt that they had a real positive impact on public life, making it more inclusive to everybody as well, which is great.
I think we might have to wind up.
Now, sort of just looking then at just sort of an overview, looking at So looking at my sort of like the findings that I found and the research that I did, I kind of made some policy recommendations to try and strengthen and to increase diversity within public life, particularly in terms of representation of disabled women. So one area that I found that there was lacking was in data collection. So making more accurate data collection within, so that's within the Senedd Cymru, but then also from councillors as well. Because once we know exactly how many people, so how many disabled people are running for positions within public life or hold a position, then we can make the actual support and can tailor the support toward them and make it more inclusive generally. I also felt another recommendation was that disabled women need to be seen. As I felt that at the moment, the time of writing my dissertation, it was really, there weren't many role models for disabled women or for disabled people generally within public life. So by having those role models, by having mentors as well, that disabled people could speak to and share their concerns with, that would actually hopefully increase the number then of disabled people running for positions within public life as well. We also wanted as well for the adoption of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, enshrined into domestic Welsh law. As I felt that if this was done, so if this was enshrined in domestic Welsh law, then this would give disabled people, and also we should make a priority then for the Welsh Government to ensure that disabled people were better represented within all levels of public life as well. And then also next recommendation was to increase positive action measures. So as I said, at the time of writing my dissertation 2 years ago, there weren't any positive action measures running. So there weren't any schemes that supported disabled people into public life. So these are schemes such as mentoring or financial support that could help disabled people with the extra costs that they incur for running for public life, such as travel, translation costs, interpretation as well. So just looking then at reflections on my dissertation, so on my research, generally I found that the policy discourse on diversity within public life was more centred on gender diversity rather than looking at the representation of disabled people as well. So in terms of increasing the disabled people's representation in public life, it would be nice to see a shift to include a more intersectional lens when we're looking at diversity within public life as well within Wales. And as it stood when I did my research, it just the discourse on diversity in public life didn't really reflect the needs of women of disabled women. So that was really important, as women that I interviewed said that they found that in some occasions their gender, so being a woman was looked at and they were supported in that way, but actually being disabled, their needs and their requirements as a disabled person weren't being met as it stood at that time. And then there's also generally one thing that I found, there's also, as I mentioned before, a shortage on data on women with multiple protected characteristics. So it's really important that we have stronger data collection techniques, and that either political parties or within public appointments or within local government, that more data is collected that reflects the intersectionality and the protected characteristics of people, so that the support can be tailored better to support people with multiple protected characteristics. And then also positive action measures have supported disabled people, so particularly disabled women into roles within public life, and that these positive action measures should be rolled out and should be continued. So at the moment, one thing that I saw was that these schemes and mentoring schemes were run for a specific amount of time, say for example a year, and then they would stop, and then another scheme would start a couple of years later. But by having a rolling scheme, that would mean that there's continuing support there for people who wanted to run for for positions within public life. So that's the end of my research. That's the main findings. So just I'd like to thank my professor. So Professor Paul Cheney, he was my supervisor within for my dissertation. And then also I'd like to thank Disability Wales, who I actually worked for at the time of writing my research. And they are currently a partner within my PhD research at the moment, the ESRC, and then also Cardiff Business School, where I'm currently based as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. Well done. Thank you very much. Hilary, there are some questions in the chat, I think.
There are.
Yeah.
I'm aware of time because we'll get kicked out. So there was an earlier question from Philippa about women with hidden disabilities, and whether you had a view as to whether you thought that they don't like to sort of admit to them at work, if I can find it. Women with hidden disabilities always feel comfortable disclosing their disability, especially in the workplace. Did you find anything about that?
Yeah, it was. I did particularly spoke to women who had sort of impairments such as autism, or on the autism spectrum, and they found it quite hard to actually get the support that they needed because their impairments were hidden. People just didn't really understand how they could meet their needs, what requirements that they needed as well. So I think women with hidden impairments, actually, the women that I interviewed anyway, found it particularly difficult to get the support that they needed, and for people to actually understand what their requirements were. And
you've talked about a lot of things that you might suggest, and that have indeed been used as the elected fund, access to elected fund. So if you now you've had a bit of time to reflect, finishing, and as you're beginning to prepare for your doctoral, can you put somehow a sort of a policy head on it, and say, as one of the questioners has asked, with Jane in the room, if there was one policy, one sort of area you would particularly advise Welsh Government to go for? No pressure, of course, Ruth. You don't have to have one. Where do you think that might take you?
So since writing my dissertation, as I said, things have actually changed in Wales. There's been some really positive measures, particularly within the last month. And so Wales actually does have now an access to elected office fund, and that will support disabled people within the elections this year into the Welsh Senedd, and also next year into local government. So I think that's fantastic that their fund's back in place now to support disabled people. What I would really like to see is that to become a rolling fund, so that it's something that's always there, supporting disabled people. So obviously the elections only happen every few years, but if the fund is there, the fund can then prepare people, disabled people, in the interim, to actually run for the next elections. So it would be lovely to see that just keep on rolling then, really.
And do you think the other two presentations have sort of mentioned the issue of getting over being that the token woman, the token non-knowing sort of rugby playing sportswoman, and maybe the token disabled woman? Can we sort of get beyond that and those awful sort of attitudes that are around? I mean,
I really hope so, because the women that I've interviewed, and people that I've come across in my work, there's a lot of potential there. There's a lot of passion, and there are a lot of disabled people who really want to make a difference. So I think it's a case of changing those attitudes towards disability. So from I would call it like a medical model, which looks at what disabled people can't do and the barriers that disabled people face, to look at a more sort of social model of disability, which looks at ways of removing those barriers that disabled people can actually take part in society. And it's a more positive way of looking at disability in itself. So I think seeing that shift, and it's happening, it really is happening in Wales, the more social model disability is taking over. And I think that will then support disabled people, but then also change attitudes within society as well.
Very interesting. I'm aware that Jane Salisbury might wave a piece of paper at me shortly. So are there anything that any of our presenters would like to make? Any sort of last minute points or comments? Or
We have 2 minutes.
we have 2 minutes.
And we have a bit of an exit time, but 2 official minutes.
Yes.
Oh, I'm.
Could I say something,
Yes,
Jane? Because Larry, because I've just sent a message saying, can you all send me your dissertations? I've sent my email address because we've shared those with my colleagues. I put a few things in the chat which might encourage you to say that some progress I think is being made. For example, particularly this research that Simon Hoffman and others have done, that's back to evidence, Bangor and Swansea and Diverse Cymru, about whether we need a human rights law in Wales and incorporation of UN conventions. And also we'll be making announcements very shortly about the impact of COVID-19 on disabled peoples. We've done one on race, and the mentoring scheme, absolutely, it needs to be a rolling programme and very intersectional. So it's been absolutely great. I have stayed, but I'm just getting to the end of my waking hours.
Yeah.
But thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Jane, for being
Yeah.
with us and giving us your time so generously. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to say what a great evening. Not an ideal slot. We had to eat early, and Master Chef has been recorded and so on. But very, very uplifting evening and really important policy agendas. And the other thing, Jane's opening earlier this morning made me proud to be a Welsh woman, to be living in Wales and doing the things that we're doing. So I think, again, Audrey was with us in spirit and so on, and behind the whole idea is she didn't want dissertations to fester on a library shelf and to only be disseminated at the faculty research group or at the Viva, And I grew up in the Cardiff mentality, which was, while you're doing your PhD, you've got to get 10 publications out, and one did. And you lot need to disseminate, not just to our policy people here like Jane, who's offering you a direct line through us, but yourselves, get it out, get it written, get it disseminated, short research notes. It doesn't have to be a big polished article. It can sometimes be headline messages. And your supervisors, you're all in excellent hands. I know many of them very well, 1 or 2 of them in the business school less well, but all I would say is we have a duty as intelligent women, empowered women, to use the channels to share evidence-based practice, evidence-based policy. So I feel it's all good news this evening, and it's been a great evening, and I thank you very much for and I know Illyri will say thank you also.
Yeah, I think what I've taken from it is the importance of data and the need for data and the evidence and collecting it and cutting it up and slicing it in every which way to look at it, and the importance of in that data including lived experience. So the 3 of you tonight have talked about lived experience, and we have to have that, because we've got to make that data into stories for people to understand and to build cohesion and to drive change. And that's what I've taken from tonight, and I've loved your presentations. And I think that's what we have to do, is to remember to focus on the data, focus on lived experience, and to demand change and say what we've got is getting there, but we have to do more, and we cannot take our eye off the ball. We have to keep driving for change. And
I think the fact that all of you have been funded by the Economic and Social Science Research Council, and as Director of Graduate Research, I know how hard those monies are, and I know what the reject rate is. So, the fact that you've been cherry picked to actually operationalize critical research, that the rejection rate is enormous. And I think there's an ethical drive to disseminate, get it out there, share it, go to your research group, ask for a mock Viva, do all the things that will make you comfortable in sharing. And I think there's a very much a qualitative feel here. I'm an ethnographer, and we do need the statistics, we do need the demographic descriptions and distributions, but we also need to hold a mirror up to the, as we say, the lived realities. Ouch, I'm in my husband's studio because it wouldn't work instead. The lived experience inside women's bodies, women's mentalities, against those groups, institutions and practices, and the resilience that some of the women you have captured was heartening, actually. So carry on, onwards and upwards. I'm going to say Nostar.
Nostar.
From
Nostar.
where?
Thank
you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Well done. Well done.
Take care. Bye.
Okay. Yeah, bye, bye. Gin and tonic. And thank you to all our participants who were the audience as well. Because we had I think 38 at the beginning. Yeah.
Yes, I think so. And you can watch it all again on, and hopefully if we can work the technology on our lovely new website. Vicky's just reminded me. So do have a look at that when you get time, but not tonight. Yeah. As you say, gin and tonic time now, or bed. Gin and tonic time, yeah, and a cuddle with Otis. Thank you ever so much, and thank you for helping us with the technology, girls. Oh yes, absolutely. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll do a nice letter to your supervisors. I'll do a nice letter, okay, to say, and to Tom Hall and the head of school. So we'll make sure it's out there what you did. Thank you ever so much. Nighty night.
Thank you.
Night.
Good night.